Hello and welcome to part 15 of our video series on building a Node, Express and Postgres based API. Today we're going to continue our work on our user creation endpoint, and we're actually going to build some integration tests. Now so far we built unit tests, which are great for testing individual blocks of code. Let's take this insert user for example. This insert user unit test checks this particular function here, that all of the code within here does what we expect it to do. But the key thing around unit tests is they don't care about things that happen outside of this code block. So this query won't actually hit a database. It will just have a mocked out implementation for what happens when that database query is called, which we do by mocking it out here. So it will just make sure that we can test what happens within this code block, which is that these values get destructured, that this query gets called with the right arguments and in the right order, but it doesn't actually go ahead and do the testing that the database is called, database client is called with the right query. So integration tests essentially do kind of end-to-end testing for your application, depending on how you write them. So the tests that we're going to work on today are tests for our user's endpoint. And what it'll do is it'll actually make an API call to this user's endpoint, and then it'll follow through all of these different areas, checking that it all works end to end. So what we'll see is all the validation rules get applied, errors get thrown if the validation rules don't get applied properly, and then finally at the end of it, this database insert is called and a user is returned back to the front end, or back to the calling, the API call that's made for within our tests. So that's how integration tests differ. It's always good to have a mix of integration and unit tests within an application to give you a really solid foundation that your code is going to work as expected when it's out in the real world. So what we're going to do today, we've got a list of things to do. If you want to follow along, there is a link in the video description to the GitHub repo that we're working from, and the branch that we're going to be working from is part 15 start. So if you check that out, you can work along with me as we go through everything here. So what we're going to do, we've got a few steps. We're going to add some configuration for our integration tests, and we've got a test config file here, which is for our unit test. So we'll add a configuration file for integration tests. We'll add some utilities to support our integration tests, because one of the most important things when running integration tests is that you can run them, you can repeatedly run them and get the same results, and that the state of your application is reset between each test. So the utility that we're going to write today is one to clear down our users table after every test, so that no users are left over in our database that could interfere with future tests. We're going to add a new dependency called axios, which is going to be the library that we use to make our HTTP requests to our API. And then finally we'll wrap up and we'll actually write a whole bunch of tests for our integration tests, and we'll see those running in the real world. So let's get started. We're going to add the configuration for our integration tests, and to do that we're just going to take this file here, this jest.unit.config.js, and we're going to copy that and make an integration config file. And what we're going to do is integration tests aren't going to have the same code coverage rules as our unit tests would, so we're going to remove the code coverage portion, and we're going to change the regular expression test there just to check for files that have got integration.test.js. And then what we'll do is within our package.json we'll run our we'll add a new command called integration test. It'll be similar to unit tests, except we'll remove the run-in band and we'll remove the coverage because we're not going to have code coverage, and then we'll update the file that it's going to be using for its configuration. So that's that piece done. What we're going to do now is we'll add a utility to help us reset our database between integration tests. What I'm going to do is within our domain folder, I'm going to add a new folder called test utils. Normally when I'm working on a code base and I want utilities that are specifically for testing, I'll just add them into a test utils folder so that I know that they're just there for testing. So we're just going to add a dbqueries.js file, and within here we're just going to add a single function called reset database. And this is just going to be responsible for making a database call to clear down the users table that we've got. So the way that's going to look is we're going to have await Postgres .client.query, and it's truncate table users. And what that's going to do, it's not actually going to delete the table, it's just going to remove all entries within the table so that we can reuse it through our testing. And we'll do module.exports equals reset database, and that'll export that for use within our code base. What we're going to do next is we're going to add axios into our package.json, and well, we're going to add it as a dependency. So we'll do npm install axios at 0.21.1, which is a version I've tested that works perfectly fine within our project. So that's added, and that should exist now within our dependencies. And then finally we'll get on to the core of what we're here to do, which is to write some integration tests for our user creation endpoint. And what I'm going to do, I typically try to create a file per series of integration tests. So we know that we're going to be testing our creation endpoint, so I'll just do create.integration.test.js within our user domain folder. So this set of integration tests is just going to be for creating a user. And what we'll do is we'll just do a describe user create. And what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to make use of a few different hooks within our integration tests to handle what's known as setup and tear down of anything that we need within our tests. And what that means is when we start running our tests, we want to make sure there's a database connection available. Before each of the tests run, we want to make sure the database is reset. And then after all of the tests have run, we want to make sure that the database connection is closed down. Otherwise, it's going to leave a hanging connection, and Jest will complain that there's something still running and it won't actually exit the test runner properly. So what we're going to do is we'll do a before all block, which is a piece of code that's going to execute before all of the tests have started. So what we're going to do here is postgres.connect. Wait, postgres.connect. Oh, it's not imported it. There we go. So we've got postgres.connect, and then what we're going to want to do is something that we've used before quite regularly is a before each hook. And what we're going to want to do is make sure that we can call our reset database function, and then after all, which will run after all of the tests within this describe block of run, it'll do a await postgres.close. So that'll actually run this close to close the connection down for us as well. So before all of the tests run, it'll connect, it'll reset between every test, and it'll tear down the database connection after all of the tests have run. So that'll give us a good structure for all of the tests that we're going to be running. So let's write our first test. Oops, test. Don't know why that's imported there. So test, and we're going to start with the status code that we're expecting to be returned, and then we'll describe what we're expecting to happen. Creates a new user. It's going to be an asynchronous test because we know that we're going to be making a HTTP call that we're going to have to wait for. And then what we're going to do, we're going to fill in the context for our test. So we're going to have a user that's created, give them a first name, just John, last name Doe, email john.doe@test.com, and then finally a password of password 123 exclamation mark, which is going to meet the expectations of the validation constraints that we've got for our user creation endpoint. So we've got that there. And then what we're going to want to do now is actually make the API call. And we're going to use our axios library, and it's going to have a post function that you can call. And what this post function is going to do is going to take a URL that it's going to want to reach out to, and then a body for the request. So what we're going to do first of all, so we're just going to import our config. And the reason for that is on our config object, we've actually got this API URL. So that's what's going to have the domain and the port that we're going to be calling for all of our API requests. And it's a good idea to have this in one place, because if you ever want to change it in the future, you don't want to have to go around to loads of different parts in your code base and change it. So we'll create an interpolatable string, and we'll do config.api URL /users, and then the body for that request, or the data, is actually going to be user. So, and we'll just do an await in front of that, because we actually want that the promise to resolve. And then what we're going to do is we'll start asserting on the response that comes back here. So whenever you get a response back from Axios, it's going to have two core things that we're going to want to work with. One is a status, which is the status code that gets returned from the response. And for any successful responses, it's typically going to be a response that starts with a 2. So like a 200 is just a generic success response. And then what we're going to want is to assert on the actual response body that comes back. And that's going to be res.data. And our API is actually going to return, the user that we've created, but it's also going to have some extra details such as a user ID and a created at timestamp as well. So we're expecting it to return the first name, last name, and email address. We're also expecting it to return an ID, but we're not sure what that ID will be. We just know that it's going to be a number, because we've set the primary key for our Postgres database to be an integer. So we'll just do expect.any and number, and that just allows us to assert that it is a number. Password, we can't just check that it's this, because what actually happens is before the password is inserted into the database, we actually have it hashed. So we'll need to be checking that this is going to be a string. If you want to improve upon this, you can add a minimum length check to ensure that it's actually a full length hashed password that comes back, instead of maybe just an empty string or something like that. And then what we're also going to have is we're going to have a created at, which is an ISO string formatted date. And what these look like is they typically look like something like 2020-01-01, and then there'll be some extra numbers after that for the hours, minutes, seconds, milliseconds, that type of thing. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to assert that it is a string, but that it's a string that is an ISO formatted date string. And the best way to do that is to actually use a regular expression. Now, I don't memorize these. I typically just go out and Google ISO string regular expression wherever I need to, and just find one there. So what we're going to do is we'll just add an expect.string matching, and then we'll add the regular expression into here. I'll put this one in the video description so that you can just copy and paste it in here, or alternatively just head over to Google and just search for an ISO string format regular expression, and you'll get one quite easily. So that'll give us our first test, which asserts that when we create a new user and it's a valid user, that we're going to get that user returned to us after it's been inserted into the database. So what we can do now is, when it comes to like integration tests, they're going to be running against a live version of your service. So what we need to do is stand up an instance of our service just using npm run dev, and that'll stand our application up. And then what we can do now is we can do npm run integration test, and this will actually run our integration tests, and we'll see we've got one passing test. We can see that the database connection was established and then closed again. Whenever my tests run and they pass first time, I'm always skeptical, so I'll typically just go in and change one of these values to something that I'm expecting to fail, just to make sure that it actually does go in and fail. So we were expecting it to be, or it returned a 200, but we changed it to expect a 400 so that we can see that it's actually doing what it says it should do. And what I normally find myself doing whenever I'm working on a whole bunch of integration tests, I'll typically find myself console logging out the data that I'm asserting, just to make sure that it's exactly what I'm kind of expecting it to be. So it is fairly common just to see console logs all over the place, just so that you can check, this does look like a user that I'm expecting to be inserted into the database and everything like that. So yeah, don't be afraid to just add logs everywhere just to check what's going on. So we've got one passing test, which is great, but what we also want to do, and sometimes what's even more important than passing tests, is failing tests. Now we have a constraint within our database that says a user cannot exist with the same email address twice, and we actually have something within our handlers here that say if the user already exists, then we're going to throw an error, which is going to be a 400 error. A 400 status code with an error message of email address is already in use. So what we actually want to do now is create a test that validates that happens. And what we'll do is we'll just create a new test, give it a 400 status code. We'll say fails to create a user as the user already exists with that email, as a user already exists with that email. So the context of this will stay the same. The user is just going to be this user. But what we're going to want to do is we'll actually call this post request twice. So it'll create the user, and then the second time it calls it, it should return an error. Now what we need to do when we're calling axios and we're expecting it to return an error, we need to wrap it in a try-catch block so that we can catch the error that comes back. Because anything that's returned to axios that's, I think it's 400 or above in status code, will get caught and sent back or get thrown as an exception. So we'll need to catch that error within here and actually assert against that instead. Now, when errors come back from axios, they're in a quite specific format. So we're going to need to assert that it is within that format first. So we'll do expect error dot response dot to be defined. And what this will do is it'll catch any errors that are not necessarily API response errors, because if for some reason this error dot response isn't defined, then it's actually not an API error that's come back, and it'll alert you to that within your tests. And then what we're going to want to do, error.response.status, which is similar to what we've got up here when it comes to the response.status. We're going to expect the error.response.status to equal 400, because that's what we defined within our code base. And then what we're going to want to do, error.response.data to equal, and then we've got our within our handler here, we've got this error message that's going to come back saying that the email address is already in use. So we're going to grab that one, pop that one in here, save that, and then we'll run back to our tests. And what we'll see is we've got fails to create a user. And what you can see, because it's a nice error, and we've got error logging enabled on our API, we can actually see the error that's being sent back from the API here. So we can see that that is being called as we're expecting it to as well. So that's going to give us the handling of this particular error where the email address is already in use. But we've also got a couple of other areas that we want to write some integration tests for, and that's around validating the data that gets passed through to the API. And what we have here, we've got a set of validation constraints for our user creation endpoint that validate that first name, last name, email address, and password are all strings. They're all required. And then we've got additional checks for password strength and email, that an email is actually a string. What I've noticed here, actually, we're missing a string.base for our email. So I'm just going to add that one. String.base, and that will say email must be a string. So just check and make sure that it's actually a string. So we've got these checks in here now. So what we're going to do is we're going to write integration tests to check these validation constraints work as we're expecting them to. So what we'll do is we'll just grab this test here. And what the first one that we'll do is we'll do fails to create a user if first name is not provided, because we've got a constraint within our code that says this first name must be passed from the front end when we're making this API call. So we'll delete the spare post call there, and we'll delete the first name from our user. And then what we're going to expect is we're still expecting a 400 response, but what we'll expect is first name is required. So because it's missing here, we're expecting when it gets this validation constraint here and it's missing, it'll say first name is required. So let's run this test, just make sure. We've got first name is required being returned, and we've got a passing test, which is great. So what we're going to do now is, it's all well and good having it just for the first name, but we actually want to run the same checks against last name, email address, and password as well. What you'll find is integration tests or even unit tests can sometimes look like we're just duplicating a lot of code, and that is true. And integration tests are, you can be a little bit more flexible. It doesn't need to be, doesn't necessarily need to follow dry principles in the same way that you would within your regular code base, and they can be a little bit more verbose. So it's fine to have kind of duplicated code in certain areas. So it's nothing to be worried about too much. So what we're going to do, we just copied this test here and added it another 3 times, and then what we'll do is we'll just update these ones to check for the last name. We'll just update this. Last name is required. Oops. Let's grab the user again. And then we'll go in here and we'll update this particular test to be email is not provided. And then we'll have email is required. And then we'll have the final one here, which is going to be for the password. And we'll remove this password and we'll put password is required. And what we're going to do now is run those tests. And what we can see here is we've got the different cases passing or different cases failing. So we've got first name, last name, email, and password being required by the validation constraints, and we've got the passing tests here showing that those are working as expected, which is great. The next thing that we're probably going to want to do is we've got that each of these fields must be a string. Now, if you're just working with people that are sending data from like a website where they're just inputting data into a form, it's probably going to come through in the right format. But in the real world, APIs can be exposed to other people to send JSON data directly to you, or people can be trying to send data to API endpoints without using a web front end and that kind of thing. So we need to support validation that's going to deal with people trying to hit our API endpoints directly and sending through whatever data they want to. So we'll add some integration tests now that is going to start sending through data that we're not expecting and making sure that these errors are actually coming back in the right format. So the first one that we're going to do is we'll do a first name test fails to create a user if first name is not a string, because that's the test that we've got. So we'll just add first name and just put that as 1. And then I believe its first name must be a string. So we'll provide a nice error to the front end or to any API, any people that are calling our API, just so they've got a nice error message that is quite descriptive. So we've got first name must be a string. And now what we can do is we can just do it for the other fields as well. So first name is not a string, and then we'll do last name is not a string. So we'll just update this to John, change that, change this, and then we'll do email is not a string. We'll just change that. And then we'll have password is not a string. And we'll just change password to that. Oops, there we go. So, and then we're going to have password must be a string, and then this error message is going to be email must be a string. So we've got tests now for first name, last name, email and password being strings. So let's run those. And we've got those error messages coming out as we're expecting, which is great. And then finally, we've got 2 more tests that we're going to write, which is going to be, we've got this string.email, so it checks that an email is a valid email address. And then we've got this password pattern, okay? And this password pattern is a regular expression that is going to check the strength of our password, and that's going to be minimum of 1 uppercase letter, minimum of 1 lowercase letter, and a total minimum length of 8 characters. So that's what the password strength validation is going to be. So we'll write a test that checks for an invalid email address and a password that is too weak. So let's go ahead and have a look at those now. So we'll just copy one of these tests. Fails to create a user if password is not strong enough. And then we'll just put in password of 1. And then we'll just do it's not strong enough. I believe that's what the validation constraint comes back with. It says password is not strong enough. So we've got that one saved. Let's run our tests. We've got password is not strong enough come back. And then finally, we'll have one that says fails to create a user if email is not a valid email address. So we'll just change this password back to something that's valid. And then we'll change this email address. We'll just remove the bit from the @ and then the domain afterwards. And then we'll just update this one to say email is not valid. I think it's email is not valid. Oops, where's the validation constraint? Email is not valid. So that looks fine. Let's run through our tests again. And we've got 12 passing tests, and we've got our password strength and email is not valid checks going on there as well. So what we've got now is we've got checks that are valid, that we've got the right fields coming through, they're in the right format, password is strong enough, email address is a valid email address. The final test that we're going to add in is, at the moment, we're expecting the body of the request that comes through to be an object. And if it's not an object, then we want to inform the person that's calling the API that we're expecting it to be an object. So we'll add in object.base, and we'll just say body must be a valid object. So let's go ahead and have a look at a test for that one now. So what's going to happen is when somebody sends a JSON body from the front end, obviously it can be an array or it can be a string. An array or an object. And anything that, like, if null or undefined is sent from the front end, Express will convert that into an empty object for us, so we don't need to check for much else. We just need to check that it is an object that's coming through. So let's go ahead and write a test for that one there as well. Just so that we got something nice going back to the front end. It's always good to think about who's going to be sending data to your API, and can you make it really obvious to people when they're sending the wrong data. So fails to create a user if the body is not an object. So what we'll do is we'll just change this user from an object to an array, and then we'll just change this message that comes back to the message we've added in. Body must be a valid object. And then we will run our tests again and just make sure that's coming through okay. So now what we've got, we should be covering pretty much all the different use cases that we're expecting to come from the front end now. We've got valid and invalid data coming through, and we've checked that invalid data coming through does not make it any further into our application than we're expecting. And that's the best thing that you can do when it comes to validating the data. You want to capture it as soon as possible within your application, which is why it sits within our root here. So it just checks that immediately, as soon as data comes in, is it valid or isn't it? If it's not valid, we just chuck it away, and that really protects the rest of our application from a lot of different attack vectors that people can be trying to exploit. And what we've got now is a really nice set of tests that will secure us just in case any of the constituent components between the entry point for our application and saving it to the database. It'll protect us from anything else that could go wrong. So let's say, for example, somebody came into our root endpoint here, and instead of returning the user, they actually ended up returning an empty object because they forgot that we need to return the user to the front end. What we'll get is a test here that says we were expecting that to actually have been an object like this. So it'll protect your code from being pushed into a production environment where it's actually going to start failing for users on the front end. And like I said, it's always good to have both a mix of unit tests, which are very quick and very easy to write, and then integration tests, which will give you some more kind of end-to-end testing capabilities over your application, just to give you a really strong foundation for your code. But that should cover it for our user creation endpoints. In future videos, we'll start to add some more endpoints around getting users, authenticating users, and then updating users as well, and it'll add some extra bits around authentication and authorization to make changes to users and things like that. But that's it for this video. I hope it was informative, and I will see you in the next one.